Okay. This is a portrait painted at the height of Rembrandt's powers in 1641. That's a year before he painted his famous Night Watch, when he was the most successful portrait painter in Amsterdam, but also the most inventive and innovative portrait painter in Europe. The sitter is called Agatha Bass, and she is 29 years old, it's inscribed with her age, and she is the wife of Nicholas van Bambeek, who was a prominent Amsterdam wool merchant. They were married in 1638. The first thing that you notice about Rembrandt's portraiture is that he is extremely anxious to recreate an effect of reality, literal, tactile reality. And you see this in an illusionistic device. He's painted his portrait as if there is a dark ebonized wood frame just inside the frame of the painting and made of a similar material to the original frame. This is a reproduction frame, but Dutch frames of this period are generally black. So the little slip of an arch would look like a continuation of the real frame. And then he's had this idea of allowing objects to project in front of that false frame. So her thumb just overlaps and her fan overlaps the frame, which creates the illusion that an object from the painting advances out of the front of the picture surface into our world. In other words, that it's not painted, but real. Normally, devices of that kind are used for, as a trick, a so-called trompe-l'œil, a deceiving of the eye, and usually it's in a still life painting, so it'll just be a cupboard door or a flower or an object of that kind. It's unusual to introduce devices of this kind into the rather more serious and elevated genre of portrait painting. But he doesn't just leave it at that one trick. He also picks up on the idea that the reality that he is painting is literal, real, and tactile. If you look at the surface of Agatha Bass's dress, particularly the lace, the stitching across her bodice, and also her fan, this is very complicated brocaded embroidery, and in reality would be very three-dimensional. You would be able to feel all the characteristics of the stitchings and the bulk of the fabric. And Rembrandt has rendered that effect literally in paint. He has built up a level of impasto, or thick paint, so as to reproduce precisely the surface which he is describing. So there are areas of this painting which a blind person would be able to recognize and to match against reality. However, Rembrandt's interest in illusionism at this date is a very, very double-edged sword, because while the lace, the fan, and the drapery has this very intense and very sharp and crisp reality, you notice that the depiction of the face is much more veiled and elusive and subtle. In particular, he's very anxious to show a pattern of light and reflected light, so that almost no surface of the face is rendered simply with an outline and a light side and a dark side. Always there are areas of reflected light and nuances of light and shadow, which create the effect that the skin is very luminous and very soft, so it's very flattering to the sitter, but they also create the effect that the face is perhaps something a little bit more subtle and more ambiguous or unknowable than a piece of lace or a fan or the mundane reality of clothes. And it's possible, I think, to suggest that that's moving towards the idea that a depiction of a face might be something a little bit more mysterious and a little bit more spiritual than the depiction of simple drapery. And you also notice that the light is not especially rational. She is advancing forwards into what is really apparently quite bright light, which is creating these almost white highlights over her lace and thing. I'm going to recycle that one. Good. So it appears as if she has advanced into quite bright light. You can see that there is a lot of white highlight on her dress, particularly on her white lace and her underdress. It's obviously very important at this date that fine fabrics are bleached in the sun. It's an expensive and important process. So you're very keen to show how white your whites are, just as you're very keen to show how black your blacks are. And her whites are plenty white. So there's a lot of light flying around. And yet it's interesting how immediately that light seems to have been swallowed into a very undefined and mysterious darkness 1 foot into the surface of the painting. So you can see her head is almost sinking into darkness. And in particular, I think the area where there's a maximum indistinctness is in her hair, which instead of, I think one might have expected it to be painted as perhaps flowing curls, instead it's painted more as if it's a cloud, as if it's a kind of an indistinct area where you cannot pick out individual strands. You're just aware of a sort of soft haze of light which sinks into this darkness. I think the interesting question is, what is Rembrandt achieving by this very contrasted alternation of extremely intense literal-minded reality, the illusionistic tricks, the fan that you seem to be able to touch, the very precise dress, on the one hand, and on the other, this veiled, soft, and ambiguous depiction of reality apparently sinking into darkness. What is Rembrandt achieving with that alternation? And that is, in a way, that's the million-dollar Rembrandt question, because he does this so often in his paintings. And I think it's very difficult to give an answer which doesn't sound fanciful, but I would suggest that the idea is that in depicting a human being, he wishes to contrast those things which are indeed tactile and absolutely simply apprehensible, the bulk of the person, the physical presence of the person, which is often expressed through clothes, and at the same time wishes to suggest something a little bit more unknowable, a little bit more mysterious about a person. I'm finished. The other aspect of this portrait, which is very interesting, is the way in which it depicts a wife in 1641. It's an absolutely common convention in Dutch portraiture of the 17th century to show husbands and wives as a pair of portraits. And the convention states that the husband hangs on the left-hand side in the dominant position, and the wife hangs on the right-hand side. And usually the wife is shown in some way turning towards or relating to her husband. And in this particular pair, the obvious relations are as you'd expect. So the portrait of Nicholas van Bambeek, the Agatha Bass husband, is unfortunately not in the Royal Collection. It's in the Royal Fine Art Museum in Brussels. But he is very clearly arranged so that he should hang on the left-hand side. In other words, he is on his wife's right, and he's leaning on a ledge identical to her ledge, so they're both sort of in the same room, as it were, looking out of windows next to each other. He leans, looking very confident, looking straight out but slightly towards her, holding his glove. So that's exactly as you'd expect. He adopts a very commanding posture. She holds a fan. Well, that's pretty much what you'd expect. But her position, I think, is exactly what you would not expect. She is not turning towards her husband. She is not looking remotely coquettish. She looks extremely powerful and determined and stares directly at the spectator. That is a position, a way of depicting the face, which is extremely rare even for men, but for women it's almost unheard of. And I think what it suggests is that it tells you something about her character, that she's a force to be reckoned with. Not that we know anything else about her except the evidence of this portrait, but I think it also tells you something about the role of women in 17th century Dutch society, which put simply that they were massively more empowered than women elsewhere in Europe at this date, and indeed it took a couple of centuries for the rest of Europe to catch up, perhaps exemplified by the fact that this sitter would have been known, and this painting is known as Agatha Bass. This is a married woman, that is her maiden name. From the top, or, yeah, okay. I'm Desmond Shaw-Taylor, surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, and one of the paintings which I've chosen for an exhibition of treasures at the Queen's Gallery in Holyrood is this magnificent portrait by Rembrandt of Agatha Bass. Magnificent, good enough for you?
It's got to be your word, but that's been quite good. Thank you very much.
And you sure you don't, that's okay? Good.
But what's 12 minutes?
Do you want to? Am I in about the same place? Yeah. If you look at the light in this painting, it's painted as if the sitter is leaning forwards or moving forwards out of the picture plane into what must be quite bright light, which is very clearly picking out the whites of her lace and underdress. And it's also important to remember how... Now, I'm not going to say that because I think that's taking us off the point. I'll start again. If you look at the light in this painting, it's clear that the sitter is moving forwards into a bright light source, which is picking out the whites of her underdress and lace, and very, very clearly illuminating it. And yet, at the same time, if you look particularly at her hair, and certainly at the background, you see that it's consumed in darkness. It sinks into darkness. And that isn't really a very rational way of depicting light. If there was this much light around here, some of it would manage to find its way back into the distance. And this is a trick. This sort of irrational use of light is a trick which Rembrandt uses often in his paintings. And it allows him to create this very, very steep gradient between the lit part of the painting and the dark part of the painting. The lit part usually at the front and the dark part usually towards the rear of the picture plane. And in that steep gradient, you get the sense of the figure is almost being swallowed by, up by darkness. And it allows him also to create these very striking contrasts between the precision and distinctness of the depiction of the fabric and the veiled, mysterious character of the cloudy depiction of the sitter's hair, for example. Is that going to be?